At that time, there were only freaks in that space. Environmentalists and tech freaks, the people on the fringe, like in crypto now. It's weirdos, like in the best sense.
Throughout his career, Christoph has always been a pioneer. He got into electric transportation early, and then he pushed an old electronics company stuck in its ways into becoming a flat organization way before it was trendy. And now he's building Otherstate, which is helping Web3 startups to birth strategic narratives to better tell the story of what they're trying to create in the world. Sit back and enjoy hearing how Christoph is challenging the gerontocratic world order.
Otherstate is a tool to help founders go to market quicker by helping them capture their strategic narrative. And by having a conversation with an adaptive bot, it collects their ideas and thoughts and then translates those ideas and thoughts into building blocks like a vision, a mission, benefit statements, elevator pitch, stuff like that, and then takes those building blocks and uses them to pre-fill communication assets like a website template or a pitch deck and things like that. So my journey into entrepreneurship was kind of, what are those things called? You know, when you have this big contraption where you put like like a ball falls into a basket, the basket swings, tips over the thing, and then falls into the next thing, and then things tip over, and blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of how I feel, how I ended up in the position that I'm in today. One thing led to another, and then, you know, I ended up in a situation where I'm literally incompatible with anything else other than doing my own thing. Like, I'm old enough that, you know, now in Web3, this is kind of like my third life. In my second life, if you will, I ran so first I worked at our family business, which is a manufacturing and engineering company for industrial electronics, and with about 100 people working there. And I worked there for about 10 years, and then I took over as a CEO. So it wasn't anything like starting from scratch. It was kind of, you know, getting into the driver's seat, if you will, of this medium-sized company. So what I did was I transformed this old company, which at the time was 50 years old already, and a very, very conservative company in a very, very conservative market. I realized that over the 10 years that I'd been working there before, that it wasn't working. Management wasn't working. We had a management team running the company, and this people telling other people what to do, and then them reporting back, and so this whole system was weird, and it didn't work. At least it didn't work for us. And that was something that was draining, energy draining. It cost money. It wasn't going anywhere. And I just saw myself sitting at the helm of something that was going to slowly die away. So at some point I decided I'm going to actually take over, which I never intended on doing. And I also decided I don't want to be a boss, you know, sitting in a leather chair behind a big desk in front of my, you know, painting of myself, directing people, you know, what to do. So my idea back in the day was to just not have management and have people run the company. That was in 2010. There was nothing that I could find out there that we could use as a blueprint. So we just started, you know, designing a structure ourselves. The people that worked there started to design the, you know, new processes where they decided, you know, that this didn't work in the past, let's do this different in the future. And we kind of started with a white sheet of paper and drew up an organizational structure. We literally sat there with a white sheet of paper and drew circles. And, you know, looking back now, this was kind of what a DAO is today in a sense, where, you know, you have different groups, people vote other people into certain positions, and this flat chaos somehow works. But with one difference being that a DAO today works a lot better than what we built back in 2010 when we finally flipped the switch. And so building this, and everyone thought we were completely nuts doing this, because that's just not how you do things, at least back in the day. So I tied myself and my image and my being to this thing that we were building. And when I finally had to step away, then I didn't have an identity anymore. I left that behind, and that was probably the hardest part. So I completely tied myself to this, and I'm not an engineer. My background is not in math and science. My background is in, I used to be an art director, and I used to do the marketing when I first came into the company and stuff like that. And in a conservative engineer-driven place like that, that's not worth a lot, at least back then. So, if you don't know in detail what you're talking about, when you're talking about a technology or a technical product, then no one takes you, serious. So in this case, I was the junior coming into the company, didn't know what I was talking about, and now I was doing this nonsense with, no boss, no managers, and whatnot. And this is obviously completely going to fail because this guy doesn't know what he's doing. So I was inevitably, tied to this thing because I was the one driving it, and everyone knew this. And also because when we started, what I just said, that nothing was working. It took probably 2 or 3 years before the first bits and pieces felt like they were coming together and starting to make sense and work. And then we had a phase of another 2 or 3 years where flat organizations all of a sudden became the thing. And no one was doing that other than us and not even a handful of others in Central Europe. And so I had to, go and give speeches and keynotes, and other people, in the organization as well. But my face was everywhere. I was in the newspapers and in the news and, all this stuff. And so that is how my whole being was kind of tied to this endeavor. And then the reason why it fell apart in the end, I mean, I guess it's a family thing, is because when it finally got to a point where it seemed like it was working good enough for me to step away and not be there on a daily basis, my family and I decided to move away to another country. And that is when things started to get weird with the family. And then another couple of years later, it just, fell apart. And that was the weird part. So it was actually in a stupid moment where things were starting to work and where it seemed like they were on the right path. But I just stepped away, and then just, I don't know, family dynamics, I guess. It didn't feel good, at least not in the beginning, for a few years at all. It's like eating glass a little bit, right? And you don't know how. Most days didn't feel like this was going to go anywhere. And I guess, in that sense, it was entrepreneurial, just trying something new. And, for me, the driving factor was that I just get, in general, I get annoyed when things are done because that's how things are done, and not because there's a reason to do them a certain way. So everything around us, many of the systems around us, and lately, financial system is a good example where things are done a certain way, and they're not done that way because it makes the most sense in this day and age. They're done that way because that's just how it is. And at least in this small bubble of our company, I had the power to change what I saw wasn't working, and it wasn't making me happy. It wasn't making us any money. It wasn't working, for anyone other than for people, I guess, who just come in, do their job, get a salary, and that's enough for them. But for everyone else, this was not working, and for me especially. And that was, for me, the driving factor and driving force to just make me do this. And it's also a reason why Otherstate exists today. Otherstate is probably a way of coping with the trauma of this nonsense. After this all fell apart, and I was just doing this and that for a couple of years, here and there, went back to my roots in art direction, did some branding work and stuff like that for smaller projects, and at some point in, I think, 2020, started down the rabbit hole of crypto and Web3 with Bitcoin, and then Web3, and then DeFi, and then everything that has to do with that. And when you ask people what Web3 means, then everyone has a different explanation. For some people, it's nothing. For some people, it's crypto. For some people, it's a scam. And for me, it is a collection of mindsets and technologies and possibilities that come together, and this combination creates the possibility of changing some of the systems out there that just aren't working for people. They aren't working for me, and they aren't working for other people. And the most prominent in our phase one right now is the financial system, and of course at the core of Web3 as well, crypto. But for me, this is a set of tools and technologies and mindsets that for the first time, at least in my lifetime, and probably also for the last time in my lifetime, it gives us the chance at least to change some big parts of the systems that we are embedded in. And that is kind of, carrying forward what I had started back then in our company, just better, because now there is different tools and better tools and more people who want to work a certain way and want to live their lives a certain way. And Otherstate is a tool to hopefully help spawn as many Web3 projects as possible in the shortest period of time. I believe in the power of narrative, of a story. That is kind of what the idea of Otherstate is based on. That everything that is made by humans and influenced by humans has its nucleus in a story. Everything can be traced down to its core to someone telling a story, someone saying something about something else, and then that influences the price or influences someone making a product or whatnot. And Otherstate is a story-making machine. It's in its infancy, but that's kind of the core idea. And by spawning as many stories, or in the case of Otherstate, strategic narratives for projects in the Web3 space, the story of Web3 can spread quicker and more easily. And like every good story, this story has a villain as well. What's suffocating a lot of people and a lot of lives, I guess, is old people sitting in power, not wanting to change anything that takes anything from their power and from their from the coziness of their life away. Potentially, maybe not, but they don't even want to try. And this is not okay. And Web3 is something that eventually and hopefully faster and faster will help suffocate this old people's economy. So that is kind of the driving factor, driving force behind that. A lot of people come and see something new and they immediately point out why this can't work. And it can't work because it's different than what they're used to. And that's not a good argument. And it's the same, with Web3 and with crypto, everyone pointing out all the flaws, everyone pointing out the spams, but no one is pointing out why this is good and how we could make this work. There's one single person in all the people that I know in my age group who has some touch points with crypto, only the investing part. And that's it. I feel like being in the crypto space or the Web3 space right now, to me, feels like 15 or so years ago when I got into the electric mobility space. At that time, there were only freaks in that space, you know, like environmentalists and tech freaks and whatever car they had, and they just, you know, ripped the motor out and put a battery in and, you know, tinkered around. And then the first trade fairs and whatnot, or exhibitions and stuff, it was only freaks. And it was just, you know, like kind of like in crypto now, where it's not normal people. It's like the people on the fringe that come together and they have this idea and everyone is looking in. And it was like that back then, by the way, as well, where for years, you know, people told me, this is never going to work. And a battery in a car, this is stupid. You can only drive 100 kilometers and it takes, you know, 10 hours to charge. And my friend at Audi, you know, says that all the batteries explode all the time and all this, you know, stuff like all the time. The press was full of horror stories of, you know, how this isn't going to work. And the first Teslas came out, and you know, the you know, journalists wrote about how they aren't going to work and they aren't working, and it's all nonsense. And the same thing is happening again. And then it took a few years, and all of a sudden, you know, you went to a trade show and people with a suit showed up and they had a proper booth, and then all of a sudden it became normal. And then normal people started talking about it as if, well, that's always been the case. Well, now we drive an electric car. And I just feel like in crypto and Web3, I feel the same. You know, it's to me, it feels very similar. And I hope the outcome is similar as well. So Otherstate right now has been in beta testing for a handful of months. And I think I've had about 15 or so projects come through, and every single time it's always something new. And this is, you know, also for me the magic, I guess, of Web3, that it feels like you can just create reality out of thin air. And I'm saying this in the best sense, you know, not like you know, let's come up with a nice Ponzi scheme and scam people, but in the sense that you have an idea, you have an itch, you have something that drives you, a passion or something that you feel needs to get out into the world. And in Web3, you can actually do that because you have the tools and you have the people and the mindsets. They come together and you can do that. And you know, that's especially in the builder scene in Web3, you know, like there's always something new. Nothing has to be the next $1 billion thing. You can have a fringe community about, you know, I don't know, like interested in whatever, building whatever, only for that community. And that can be a thing, and that's enough. Not all of those things are going to work out, but some will. And that's enough. Where, you know, in this old business, it was like I had to take over and carry the weight of 50 years of things being done in often weird ways. And that means it's a lot of responsibility, like tons and tons of responsibility, not just from me, but also at that time, because I had taken over such a big stake in the company, and I had to sign for, you know, for loans and stuff like that as well, to finance things that weren't things that I had to, you know, that I didn't do. I just took them over, and I had to carry that responsibility for things that other people had done. And now, you know, clean slate, I'm just trying to avoid, you know, carrying things that have nothing to do with me. I don't want to be responsible for, you know, someone else. I don't want anything that weighs me down. I just want my laptop and a desk and a chair, and that's all I need. I don't want to have to deal with retirement insurances. Like all of this gave me sleepless nights, and I don't want that anymore, because it's just a lot of weight to carry, especially if it's not yours. And the learnings are just to kind of keep it as lightweight and flexible as possible, at least, at this moment. Doing this with a family is like looking at the crypto price charts opposed to the S&P 500. It's just, when it's up, it's up. When it's down, it's awful, but at least we have the opportunity and the possibility to, take this to higher grounds and not, die in mediocrity. I'm trying to just focus on doing the one thing and getting to the next step. So right now I'm moving from the beta phase into the first paid phase, and then see how that works, where we find a price point. And then if and when that works, then I'm gonna, look into the next bigger step. And I can totally see this to kind of morph into a structure that enables people to quickly build stories, strategic narratives for businesses that populate the space. So the way it is right now is that you have this conversation with this adaptive chatbot that adapts to what you say and then plays your answers back to you if it needs to drill deeper. And then those bits and pieces that you give it are being put together, and building blocks, like I explained earlier, vision or mission or value proposition, stuff like that is manufactured from that. And then the end output is a template where you, like a pre-filled website or a pitch deck and whatnot. And I can totally see how a community that keeps building and optimizing these building blocks in order to collect these thoughts and ideas from founders, and then creates models to, maybe even feed that in an AI to create automated outputs that are based on this very, very specific input that it gets, and just have like an open source ecosystem where you can combine, those building blocks and whatnot. But this is all, further into the future, and, might take a completely different path. I'll just have to kind of take it step by step and slowly as, just showing up. You just have to stick with what you're doing. That doesn't mean with the project that you're doing, but just doing your thing, and, not letting anyone else tell you this is, not how you do it, because it's bullshit. Like, anyone who tells you this is not how it's done has no idea what they're talking about. If someone knows what they're talking about, they try to learn about what you're doing first, and then you can have a normal conversation with them. But this is not how you do it, because this is not how it's done. And this is actually where the name is coming from too, that, that building that other state, the new state, that is the future state, the mind state, that is replacing the old state, the old people's economy.
If you're building in Web3, definitely check out Otherstate, especially if your team might be strong in technical skills but lacking in the marketing and branding department. You can find them on Twitter at @TheOtherstate or on their website, otherstate.com.